I had always worked with a paradigm that was so common that I assumed my mother had been a high school girl who became unexpectedly pregnant, got sent off to Aunt Martha's 250 miles away, had a baby that was placed for adoption, then she came home. And if that had been the case, there would never, you and I wouldn't be here. There would never have been a book. There would never have been a story.
This is A Joyful Rebellion, the podcast that explores that moment you realize the life and success you worked so hard to create didn't come with all the fulfillment you thought it would. I'm your host, James Walters, and I want you to be the author of your own story. Each week, I connect with people who inspire bold answers to the question, what do I do now to create a life I love? If you're ready to start answering that question for yourself, you're in the right place. So let's start a joyful rebellion. My guest today has a fascinating story to share with us. Edward Gangi grew up knowing he was adopted, though it was never discussed in his family. And it wasn't until later in life that he got curious about his birth parents and began a journey that would take him to a few different states, introduce him to a lot of people he would have never met otherwise, and ultimately inspire him to write a memoir about what he found. Edward is the author of The Gift Best Given, a story of adoption, search, discovery, and reunion. So silence your notifications for the next 45 minutes as Edward and I discuss his story. I feel confident you'll be glad you spent this time with us. Edward Gangi, thank you for being here on this Joyful Rebellion.
Hey, James, thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, we are sitting it's the town where you live.
We are sitting in the public library in North Carolina's writingest town.
Yeah? Is it really?
It really is. I think the folks in North Carolina consider the state the writingest state. And Hillsborough, I'm told, has more published authors per capita than any place else in the state.
Wow. And you're one of those?
We've got some very significant authors here, Lee Smith and Jill Corkle and Alan Gurganis. These are all New York Times bestselling people.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Lee Smith because when I met you a few weeks ago, we were in Southern Pines doing an authors event at the library. And I was at the time doing a writers in residence at the Weymouth Center for the Arts, which is there in Southern Pines. When I get there, I typically will write all day, whatever part of the book I'm in. And then by about 6 o'clock, I'm spent just emotionally just looking at page or my laptop, whatever. I picked up a book. They've got lots of books there and I'll pick one up. And they're typically from people who have been there working as a writer in residence sometime in the past. But I picked up one of Lee Smith's books and it was called The Last Girls.
That's one of her earlier books, I think.
Yeah, I think it was 2002. And I got about halfway through before I left the residency. And of course, I wasn't going to take the book. So now I have to go get the book to finish. That was a fascinating book that sort of happened over the span of a few decades. And I love the way she wrote that. But we're here to talk about your book, which also spans many decades. It sounds like just from talking with you. I mean, the story does.
It does. It has its origins back in 1947 as it pertains to me, and
right,
and then resumed its life in 2017 as it pertained to me.
I found it fascinating, and the reason I wanted to talk with you is A Joyful Rebellion in the context of this podcast anyway. It's about that time when you realize you want to make a big change in life, or you just have to go on an adventure that's been gnawing at you a little bit. And it sounds like you lived a really great life knowing that you were adopted.
Pretty much the whole time, yeah. I was adopted in 1948 at a day old and literally brought home by my adoptive parents the next day, and could not have had a more positive adoption experience. And not everybody does, but it was a wonderful experience. And it was only randomly, a couple of times a year, I would start to think, gee, I wonder who would have possibly given up a great kid like me. And then just went back to doing what I was doing. And that sort of continued on and on, the same kind of pattern. A couple of times a year, I give it some random thought and tuck it away and just go back to life.
It sounds like life was good and you had some curiosity, but it was later in life that you really got curious and set out on this adventure. Because in conversation with you a few weeks ago, it sounded like there were times when you were living your life and you weren't curious enough to start asking questions or start doing research. But what happened? Did you have more time to think about it, or what was the impetus for starting to really ask the questions and doing the research?
I think there were a couple of things that started me thinking about it and didn't necessarily put me into action, but there were a number of television shows for a period of time, some still on, which talked about search for lost family. There was and still remains, obviously, the ubiquity of Ancestry.com and recreational DNA testing. So that was certainly talked about a lot in the media and on television. And then I was also in the process of reading a book called The Lost, and it was written by a man who's a professor at Bard College up in New York. And he went on a search for 6 distant members of his family who had perished in the Holocaust. And he obviously knew what had happened to them in general, but he wanted to know in specific for each one of those people what had taken place. And remarkably, over a period of years, he researched that story and he found the fate of each one of those people.
Wow.
And my wife and I were up in a cemetery in New Jersey where my adoptive mother's family were all interred. And we were standing over my adoptive grandparents' grave. And at that moment, I just started thinking, okay, if Daniel Mendelsohn, the author of The Lost, can travel around the world twice and find out what happened to 6 people who had perished, 60, 80 years ago, how hard should it be to find out the story of these grandparents I had? And again, remember, these were the adoptive grandparents. And I came back here to this very library the next day and plugged in their names into Ancestry just to see what would happen. And remarkably, I found all sorts of information came back. And there was a moment where I sat there and I thought, if it's this easy to find a pair of Ukrainian immigrants who came to the country at the turn of the 20th century, I wonder if I couldn't possibly find out something about the woman who had placed me for adoption. That was the real triggering moment.
Okay. So your curiosity really started when you went back to New York and you started thinking, I want to know more about these people who immigrated from Ukraine and became my adoptive grandparents.
Right. That was kind of the aha moment, I guess.
All right. And I remember the overall feeling I had when we started talking. You waited a long time to start asking these questions about your own ancestry, about who it was that gave you up. Like you said, you would maybe think about it once or twice a year, but now you were going to start putting names to these questions. What was that experience like when you got started?
Well, I was very fortunate. My adoption was privately arranged. So there was paperwork that was attached to it. And remarkably, somehow my adoptive mother had gotten hold of the adoption decree, folded it up, put it in an envelope, and stored it away in a fireproof box. And my adoptive mom, at the point I started to search, had been deceased for 30 years at that point. But we still had the box and we still had that envelope. I had looked at the paper in there a couple of times over the course of the years, and I recalled that my adoptive parents' names were on it, their attorney was on it, and to this day, I don't know how I knew intuitively it was their attorney, but it was. There was a 4th name there. And I had never recognized it before, but as I sat here at the library thinking, okay, I'm going to take this farther, instinctively, I knew that name had to be attached to my birth mother. So I hustled myself home. I got that name, came back here, plugged it in, and the journey began.
The journey began. What was the feeling you had when you put that name in and the information started coming up?
Well, there's initial hesitation. You sit there with your finger over the enter button, say, do I really want to do this? And do I want to know what I'm going to find? And I pressed the button and a screen full of information came up, and some of it not particularly interesting, but I kind of went down the line and looked, and I picked the date of the record that was closest to my birth. And it was a visa application traveling from Miami, Florida to Rio de Janeiro 10 months after I had been born. I pressed that button. The application was written in Portuguese, but completed in English. So it gave me a lot of information fairly immediately. And as a 2-page document, that second page was a photograph of my mother looking back at me.
Oh, wow.
And the photograph taken 8, 9, 10 months after I was born. Well, you just sit there and you look at it. I was looking around me, wondering if anybody else is looking. And there was no reason anyone should even care. But it was so interesting just seeing those eyes coming back at me.
Yeah. Wow. So how did that feel when you hit enter, you saw this information come up? Was there a minute of, I wonder, is this real? Is this, what exactly am I looking at? Did you have a little bit of that feeling?
There was exactly that feeling. You look at it and say, is this person real? And what is this all telling me that I'm looking at in terms of the application and all the information on it? And I carefully went through all of it. And, in Portuguese, there was a blank line that said profissão, which asked for the person's profession, and it listed her as an artista. That was not helpful, but I had always worked with a paradigm that was so common that I assumed my mother had been a high school girl who became unexpectedly pregnant, got sent off to Aunt Martha's 250 miles away, had a baby that was placed for adoption, then she came home. And if that had been the case, there would never, you and I wouldn't be here. There would never have been a book. There would never have been a story. I would have been happy to know what happened. That would have been enough. But now I'm looking at Artista, and that made me really curious. That was this second hot button in activating this journey.
Right. Because as you found that visa application, that was just the tip of the iceberg. And I imagine, knowing what I know about your story, as soon as you started to dig into what Artista meant, you were able to find a lot more information, because she wasn't a high school girl who got pregnant and sent off to Aunt Martha's to save the family dignity, or whatever you might want to call it, that was common back in those days. It was a much bigger story than that.
Yeah, she was a 23-year-old woman, so she certainly was not the high school girl, and she had a profession. Little did we know what it was.
Let's just go ahead and start talking about that, because what was it like when you started asking and getting curious about, okay, what does Artista mean? And what was the next document that came up related to that search?
The next document that came up related to that search, and I came back, I sent that document home and I showed it to my wife and said, I want to show you a picture of my mother. And she and my mother were close, my adoptive mother. And she said, I've got all sorts of pictures of your mother. And I said, nope, not this mother. And my wife, Linda, is very good at looking at something and saying, well, it looks just like. So, of course, she said it looked like me, and I didn't see that. But then she said, oh, it looks just like James, our son. And it does look like James, our son.
How about that?
So I came back to the library the next day. These were the first 2 visits of many to the library. Put the name in again and started looking. I found a marriage license for her, dated 1955. So this is 7 years after I was born.
Okay.
And what I found there was her maiden name of Norowski, which was, she came from a very conservative Polish Catholic family. I found the name Norris, Noris, which I couldn't make much out of, and I later found out that was a stage name that she had adopted. And then I found her new husband's name, which was Meza, and both of them were listed as performers. So now Artista has turned into performer. So it gave me a little bit more to work with, and I pondered that for a bit, and sitting at the computer as I went to Google and put in Genevieve Norowski, performer, got nothing back. Put in Genevieve Norowski or Genevieve Norris, performer, and lo and behold, I came back with a blog post which had been written by an antiques dealer in South Carolina. And she, to make a long story short, had been at an auction. And she and a partner had purchased a number of very big pieces of folk art, which my mother and her new husband had produced. And she explained that these pieces, which were popular as folk art, were originally produced as props for the big ice skating shows in the 1950s, and that both my mother and her husband had been performers in those shows. So that gave me a lot more to work with. And now I'm back in Google doing Genevieve Norris skater, and I got another blog post that popped up, again from an antiques dealer, this one in Georgia, who had been at the same auction as the first person. And I'm looking at her blog post, and there were probably half a dozen promotional photographs of my mother. There was a copy of her first professional contract. There was a copy of her middle school diploma. And the woman explained that she had gone to this auction. It was Women's History Month. She saw what she thought was a very intriguing looking woman from a very intriguing point in time. Knowing nothing about her, she bought the box of stuff and then posted some of these things. Next thing I did is I started looking for the antiques dealer. Yeah, there was no reply to, and it had been posted several years before. So number one, I feared it was out of date. And number two, greater fear is that anything she purchased, she had already resold.
Wow. So you keep going, peeling back the onion a little bit at a time. And the thing that's so impressive about that part of the story is you found a little bit of information on Google, but it just goes to illustrate how much depth of information you can get out of talking to a person one-on-one, because you found her name attached to that first antiques dealer in South Carolina, but that's the person who told you that the folk art was used in the ice skating and helped you connect a lot of dots that you can't off of a Google search. So that's great information for anyone who ever wants to go on a journey similar to that. It sounds like it's not all about the online searches and the websites and things like that. You've got to talk and be a real detective.
Yeah, it's interesting. I did ultimately talk with that first antiques dealer, and she was as helpful as she could be. She didn't know a lot. She said, I know there were more things. I said, you know where they are, who has them? She said, all I knew is it was in a trailer on the side of a hill. That didn't help me immediately. I later found out, and pretty much stood at the bottom of that hill. The trailer was gone, but I knew the story then. But she turned out to be exceptionally kind, exceptionally helpful. And it turned out that she had a daughter who had placed a child for adoption. So she took a personal interest in all of this. And subsequently, we went to an antiques fair here in North Carolina, met her, met the man with whom she had purchased all those bigger pieces. But yeah, the real breakthrough came with that box, the box of stuff the second dealer had purchased. And I went looking for her by name on Facebook, found two people with the same name. One was in California. The other one was an antiques dealer in Georgia. And I sent her a message. And pretty much anybody I reached out to in that early stage, I would just say I was pursuing a possible family relationship. And that's what I did. And I said, the woman whose pictures you showed is somebody who may be a member of my family. And if you have the time, could you please call me or let me know if you still have those materials or any of them? And she responded to me very quickly. And she said, I've got all of them, but I'm babysitting my grandchildren right now. Really busy. I'll call you back. So I sat by the phone for 6 or 7 days. And when it didn't ring and I didn't get a message, I dropped the pretense and I sent her another message. The woman whose pictures you have is the woman who placed me for adoption 67 years ago. And if you possibly have time, could you get back to me? And within 5 minutes, the telephone rang. And she apologized. She said, I got so busy, I forgot all about it. I'm so sorry. I've got it all. You need to come here now.
Oh, so road trip.
So probably about a week later, my wife and I were on the way to Georgia. And the next day we met them in our hotel, and Toby, the antiques dealer, came walking in with that same carton in her arms. And she said, my husband will be parking the car. He'll be in just momentarily.
Goodness.
And he walked in probably 5 minutes later carrying a sword and shield like you would see with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Okay.
And he attracted a little bit of attention.
I'm sure.
And it turned out that those were pieces that had also been produced for the ice shows. And we sat probably the next 3-4 hours going through that carton of materials. And there was all sorts of materials for my mother. There was also a stack of photographs of other ice skaters, which were all autographed and personalized to my mother. Most of them saying, we're going to miss you, to the most wonderful skater we ever knew, to the most fun person we've ever known. And then another one that said, to the best roommate ever, love Izzy. So I'm quickly writing down names, thinking that I can go back to Ancestry and Google, try to track down some of these names, and maybe somebody can tell me some more about my mother, possibly who my father was. And he'd been a total afterthought in this whole thing.
Mm.
And as I was writing down the names, Toby's husband said, "What are you doing?" And I explained what I wanted to do with those names. And he just shook his head no. And he took two hands and pushed the carton across the table. And he said, "This is all yours." He said, we've been holding it for you."
How about that?
Yeah. So it was a wonderful gift. And this whole search has been full of these wonderful gifts and lots of serendipity. And I ultimately did go through every one of those names. Found some where the women were deceased, others I could not find. I got to Izzy and did some real searching there and found her husband's obituary. And he had been a very prominent military person in the Second World War. It indicated that he had been married for 60 years to his wife, Isabel Smith, ice skater with the Ice Follies. And it gave the name of two sons. I could not find Isabel, but I wrote a letter to one son who was up in Minnesota. And I sent a photostat of the picture of his mother, one of my mother, and explained what the story was and said, "I don't know if your mother is alive or not, but if you could get back to me, anything you could tell me, I'd appreciate." And within a week, he called back and he said, "Mom is still alive. I've shown her both those pictures and she is so excited.
Oh, wow.
She wants to talk to you."
That's so good.
And I was real excited. He said, "Okay, tell me, how do I reach her?" Then he just paused. He said, "But I need to tell you, Mom is in a memory care facility."
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. He must have heard the hesitation. He said, "There's a good thing to this." He said, "Mom doesn't have a clue what she had for breakfast today, but she will tell you minute for minute what took place in 1947.
Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah, so I called. The front desk, switched me to a duty nurse, and the duty nurse ran and got Isabel. So Isabel and I talked for the better part of an hour. And what was really cute is I started by saying, I introduced myself, and she said, yeah, I know. And I realized, I said, to ask somebody who is in her 90s about what happened in 1947 is unfair. And you could hear a pause and almost visibly hear her sit up real straight. She said, "Who told you I'm in my 90s? I said, "Oh, okay." She said, "I'm 88. I said, "Oh, okay." She said, "As a matter of fact, I'm 85. So I just left it right there. I was not arguing. I did the math real quick on my side, and she was not 85. But we had a wonderful conversation. Turned out that in the process of her ice skating career, the same time she was rooming with my mother, they would spend their summer in San Francisco, which is where I was conceived, and then open their tour in Los Angeles. And they would bring in all sorts of dignitaries and celebrities. Isabel was dating Ronald Reagan at the time.
Wow.
And I was chuckling, thinking I could have been Ronald Reagan's love child, but he picked Izzy instead. And as we got to the end of the conversation, I said, "If I could put together the hotel points and the airline points, would you like us to come and visit you?" And she said, "Yeah, that would be wonderful. I'd really like that. How old did you say you are?" I said, "I'm going to be 69. She said, "I'm 65, So my wife and I did travel out there. We had a wonderful visit with her. She told me lots and lots about what my mother was like, but really could not tell me anything about who my father was. That's still one of the high points of the whole visit, the whole journey.
Yeah, it just keeps getting better and better as you go into the story. So you went from knowing a little bit more because this was your birth mother's roommate for a time. How long were they roommates?
They were only roommates. Probably, I'm thinking Genevieve, my mother, joined Ice Follies in January of 1947 and left in January of 48. So they were roommates for the better part of a year.
Okay. And so this group, they were well known. They went around the country.
Yeah, it was the first of the big ice shows, and it was very popular, and they toured coast to coast. I was the product of a summer romance, is what we finally determined. My mother left San Francisco. They performed in Los Angeles for several days. I suspect somewhere on the train on the way to Chicago, she felt something was wrong, and she continued to perform until, number one, it was confirmed that she was pregnant.
Oh.
And as long as she could safely do that. But she came from New York originally and very close to where I grew up. And she returned to New York City in secret and basically just sequestered herself away, and fortunately had the resources because of the profession and her place within it, that she could manage the pregnancy and ultimately my adoption without anyone knowing. The only people who knew were her oldest sister, who was probably 12 or 13 years older than her, and her sister's husband.
Wow, how about that? When you started doing this research, you found that she came back to New York. Did you ever tie in, like, how did she know your adoptive parents, or did she, or was there any connection there?
Yeah, that's a pretty remarkable story, actually. And I think the reason I had such a good adoption experience is she had a list of the things she wanted my parents to be able to provide for me. She was encouraged to sit down, make a list, and don't settle. There was a woman in the hospital where she gave birth who kind of assumed a maternal role because Genevieve could not reach out to her own mother. This was a time then, as you've alluded to, that an illegitimate pregnancy was a hard thing for the mother to manage, and it brought great shame to most families. She was encouraged to do that. As I said, the only people on her family side who knew she was pregnant were her sister. Her sister's brother had been in the movie business in training films and had had a history with the Office of War Information during World War II. And I'm trying to verbally paint a picture, but there was a big Paramount motion picture studio just outside of Manhattan. And during World War II, the Army and the Signal Corps took over that facility to make training films and to publish documents. And many very prominent literary people wound up there one way or another. But as it happened, Charles, the brother-in-law, spent some significant amount of time there. My adoptive mother and my adoptive father both were in the Signal Corps during World War II. So we don't know whether or not Charles and my parents knew one another, but there was a central figure, or a key figure there, a man by the name of Eddie Sens. And Eddie Sens was a very prominent motion picture hairdresser and makeup artist. He happened to be a very good friend of my adoptive parents, and as it turned out, a very good friend of the doctor who delivered me, and we suspect the brother-in-law of my birth mother. So he sort of became the point. We assume there was a conversation where Charles, the brother-in-law, said, "Hey, you don't know anybody looking to adopt a child, do you?" And I suspect that my adoptive parents had made clear to him that they were unable to have their own and were looking to adopt a child. So Eddie Sens became the person that put the two sides together. Whether or not they actually knew one another or not, still a little bit in doubt.
Okay. It gets better and better.
Oh, it does get better. I say it's the gift that keeps on giving.
It really is. And that's part of the title of your book. What brought about the title?
The title came as a discussion between Genevieve, my mother, and that woman in the hospital who supported her during the process. And I think at the point that Genevieve was troubling over the fact that she found she was pregnant and was debating what to do, she basically said the gift I was given was to ice skate. And the woman basically said, sometimes the best gift you have is the gift that you give. And so that's where the gift best given came from. And it's the thought that, number one, she gave my adoptive parents the gift that they were looking for, and certainly gave me a very significant gift in being so specific about what it was that she wanted for me.
Right. And how did that feel when you found that out? All the wondering that you'd done, even though it sounds like it was casual wondering a little bit here and there as you went through your development years. And when you got to that point and you heard about that conversation, what went through your mind?
Yeah, it's an emotional moment, or it was an emotional moment. And I've said this before to people that probably up to the point of writing this book, I looked at at adoption as just an event, that a woman unfortunately becomes unexpectedly pregnant and is forced to give away a child, does that, and then life for everybody just goes on. And I learned in writing this and in talking to people and in researching and just common sense that it's not nearly that cut and dry an event. It's a life changer for the birth mother. The thought process and the emotions that go into the decision. It's the physical trauma of saying, here's my child, good luck. And then you live with it every day after that. So that's really what I think made me realize the depth of what that decision is all about. I'm slowly working on the sequel to this book, and in doing so, I've interviewed a number of birth mothers from a little bit later than Genevieve's era, but the 50s and the 60s, and this was all what they called the baby scoop era. It was before contraception was readily available, before Roe versus Wade. And you talk to these moms who gave away children, they all tell the same story, that I made the best decision I could, or I was not given the power to make a decision. It was made for me, but there is not a time since then that I have not thought about that child and who he or she might be and where she is and how she is. And some of these moms said, I think of them every day. Others say, on their birthday and on Mother's Day and on Christmas Day, thought comes through, but none of them will say, gee, never gave it a moment's thought after that.
Because it's a part of them forever, part of their story, it's part of their history. And that makes me curious, when you set out on this journey of discovery and you started peeling back the layers, you probably went into it knowing that a lot of the key people were no longer alive. And in some ways that made your job a little bit more difficult in getting information because you were getting it third hand through antiques dealers at this point, right? I need more information. I got to talk to my antiques dealer. So I think that the question that keeps coming up as we're talking is it probably made getting the information a little bit more difficult because when you were able to talk to Isabel, she gave you a ton of information and she, like Benjamin Button, she aged backwards through the whole process, which is fantastic for her. But did the fact that there were a lot of key people who were deceased, did that make it emotionally a little easier in this process, or did it make it more difficult?
I think it potentially made it a little easier because I don't think you know what you'll encounter if you find one of these key people alive. My thought had always been that now that I've kind of know the story, wouldn't it be cool to walk in, meet my mother, and really my only desire there was to say, you made a terribly difficult decision, and I want you to know how well it turned out. And, she may have said, get the hell out of my room. That's a possibility, or latched on and never let go. But I never had that opportunity. She had passed away by then.
Right.
I did ultimately learn who my birth father had been. He also is deceased, so there was never an opportunity for those moments. Yeah, I've had a number, not a great number, but a relatively good handful of conversations with women who came out of the same era as my mother and who had skated with her. And they all tell basically the same story about what kind of person she was, but really didn't have a whole lot of insight. And part of that was because my mother tended to keep to herself and be a somewhat private person. And I think part of that may have been the fact that she was different from then in that she had given up a child for adoption and then went back to ice skating. So she was dealing with career and whatever emotional baggage she may have carried.
Yeah. And when you got into this journey, you didn't get into it with the thought of, I'm going to find my birth parents and write a book about it. That's never the first thought. How far into this were you before you started realizing, you know what, I want to write this down. I want to put this down. And who did you write it for?
Yeah, those are a couple of good questions. I think I started the book with a line that a book was never intended and I never expected to find a story.
Yeah.
But I did. The more I found, I just started writing things down. And it was largely in memoir form, just memoir essays. I had a very good friend who matter of fact, I just had coffee with him this morning, so it was kind of a repeat performance. But we would meet downstairs at our local co-op market, have coffee at 8:00. And I would tell Chris about, this is what I found. And he kept on saying, you need to write a book. You need to write a book. And he was in the process of writing a book at that point. So ultimately, we would have our coffee down at the market. And then at 9:00, when the library opened, we'd come up here and he'd sit on one side of the table. I'd sit on the other and just start writing. Your good question is, who did I write it for? Didn't have a clue. I was recording facts. So I had a stack of memoirs or a stack of memoir essays. And then as I found out more and more about my mother, I started filling them in with where she was, who she was with, what was likely said. And all of a sudden, these stack of memoir essays had turned into a 360-page book.
Wow.
And to the end, I had no clue who was it for. I just wrote because it was a story. It was my story. And I think I did what every naive author does. I started querying agents, expecting they would come clamoring and offer me a lot of money. And after several months of finding out that wasn't about to happen, I started exploring the hybrid presses that were out there. And I've been doing a pretty good job of educating myself on just publishing in general. I ultimately made the decision to independently publish the book. And I found a woman who I thought was a quite good editor. I found a couple in Australia who were book formatters and designers. I had a local friend here who was a graphic artist who said, I can save you some money. I'll do your cover for $100 and a 6-pack of beer. And that's ultimately what happened. And it's funny, that book cover was very much modeled around one of Lee Smith's books and the cover. One day I was sitting at home and here came the proof copy of my book and the rest is history. But then I thought, okay, now who do I sell this to? And because that really was not why I'd written it. But once you're holding it, you're saying, I'm sure the world wants it.
Yeah.
So I started with the skating community. Yeah, I found there was some receptivity there. Most of those women, as I discovered as I went through those photographs earlier on, were deceased or probably no longer recreational reading. And the younger ones, I don't think, had quite the same interest in that 1940s era. So then I started thinking, okay, who else would be interested? People who were adopted. I went onto Facebook and I looked for adoption groups, assuming everybody had the same interests I did. And what I found out is the adoption groups on Facebook were essentially support groups, and most of these people felt they had terrible experiences with adoption. And quite honestly, many didn't want anything to do with my story. Number one, they either said probably wasn't as you thought it was. And I'm thinking, okay, I lived it. It was good. Or we just don't want to hear it. That's not our story.
Wow.
So it's been a slow process. The book has been well received. The book sells well. And it's a matter of finding the way to contact the right audience, which has turned out to be mature women, whether or not they're involved in the adoption experience at all. They can understand another woman's story, and they find the references to New York in the 1940s very interesting, and the adventures that Genevieve went on very interesting. So that's been a very good audience, actually.
That's really great. And it sounds like from when we started, this was never discussed in your home growing up by your adoptive parents. Did they ever acknowledge it?
No, it's to the best of my knowledge, there was never a discussion about my being adopted.
Okay.
And in the 1940s, the philosophy seemed to be hold your child, tell them you love them, and don't provide any information unless they ask, and then be honest. And I've heard that from a number of parents who received that kind of advice. I found out fairly early on, going through my parents' papers, I was adopted. I never asked, though. I never questioned them about it. My guess is they were thinking, if he's not asking, we're not telling. And converse of that is I was sort of thinking, if they're not talking about it, I guess I'm not supposed to ask.
I understand that dynamic quite well. So you've got a son, right?
That's correct.
Have you guys talked about this since the book has come out at all? Has he been curious about, hey, what was that like?
He's shown curiosity. He's been part of the journey. I discovered a half-brother in Georgia and have visited with him several times, usually with my wife. But James, our son, came down with me one time just so the two of us together could spend time with my brother. And then there's a whole long story about neither my birth mother nor her husband were ever interred after they had passed away. Both of them were cremated. And after I had met my half-brother, I had poked around Google and cemetery records in Georgia trying to find out where my mother was buried. And I finally came out and asked him, I said, where is their mother buried? And he very matter-of-factly said, oh, she's not. And he said she was cremated. I'm thinking the worst about what might have come of her ashes at that point.
You're right.
I said, well, where are her ashes? And he said, oh, it's on the shelf in the closet. It turned out, I think that his dad had passed away almost 20 years before my birth mother.
Okay.
And my guess is she might have said, let's wait until I pass away and bury us both together. And by the time she passed away, my brother was having some financial difficulties, and I just don't think he could afford to do anything. So he had kept the remains. So I quietly went about contacting cemeteries and pricing what would it cost to get them interred someplace.
Right.
Then we did ultimately arrange that, and I talked to my brother, and I said, I know this is a very personal thing. What would you think if we can find a place where we can put the ashes and we'll get a priest to come and do a blessing? And he was all over it. He thought it was wonderful.
Oh.
So it was good. So, my son came down with my wife and I when we did that. And it was a nice moment. He's definitely been part of it.
So if someone is listening right now, they want to get your book, they want to read your book, or they want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, the way I like best is the book is available on my website, which is at www.dgangiauthor.com. And the book is now available in paperback, hardback, large print, and in ebook format. It's widely distributed, so if you care to go to your local bookstore or use bookshop.org, please do that. Support your local indie bookstores in particular. It's available through the online retailers. And if you don't want to have that book on your shelf, go to your local library. If it's not there, they will order it for you.
Last question I want to ask about the process, the journey that you went through. You started this journey later in your life and you had a great adoptive family experience. When you started meeting all of these new people and learning about the life that your birth mother, did it in any way mess with your identity, with your feelings of, okay, things could have been this way, things might have been this way. I feel like I got a really great experience in life. But was there anything that came after the
No, I think the experience has added to my life. It's not altered it significantly. It's not made me regret anything. If, get into this discussion of nature versus nurture, I think I benefited from the nurturing that I experienced. My brother and I are very different people. We grew up very different places and very different environments. And I can't imagine not being me when I look at the two of us, but it's added to our family. I found this half-brother. I found a paternal half-brother as well, who, when I contacted him, he said, this is great. I always wanted a brother. And a number of first cousins who have been exceptionally welcoming. It's added to life, not taken anything away whatsoever. I'm glad I went on the journey. I'm glad of what I found, and I've got no regrets. Makes me wish I had asked more questions earlier.
Okay, I was curious about that. And you're coming out with a sequel to the book. Tell me about that.
My mother gave me up in May of 1948. By October of 1948, she was back touring again. And she toured through the remainder of 48 and all of 1949, traveling around the United States, then Central and South America, and then came home at Christmas time. And not long after that, went with Holiday on Ice to tour in Europe. And she continued to tour through 1956 when she became pregnant with her first son by her new husband. And the new book is going to do two things. One is to trace her journey because she did interesting things in interesting places. But number two, also talk about the emotions that she experienced having relinquished a child for adoption. And it goes back to that discussion that we had before about it's not a one-time event. It's something that stays with you. My mother kept about 50 or 60 pages of handwritten notes, and using that to formulate her voice, I'm writing a series of diary entries for her, talk about where she is, but which also talk about what it is she's feeling while she's there.
Wow, it sounds like that might be a little bit therapeutic for you.
The first book was therapeutic, so is this one. Just in learning that many adoptees think that, gee, I was just cast off. I was a carefully considered decision, and I never felt cast off, but it's nice to know how much went into my winding up where I wound up.
Yeah, that's a beautiful story and a really interesting journey. And I'm glad we got to meet here at the library and have this conversation. Thank you for sharing all that you shared. And thank you for your book, because it sounds like you didn't know who you were writing it for, but I'm sure some people have gotten in touch with you to tell you how much that book has meant to them.
Yeah, absolutely. There's probably not one book event where somebody hasn't come up afterwards and said, don't tell anybody, but I'm adopted. Or I gave up a child back in 19 whenever. There are a lot of people touched by adoption out there. And you're right, the book has touched many of them.
Yes.
Yes, I appreciate you saying that.
Thank you for doing that. And that's a lot of what this is all about, is telling your story. And I like to invite people to tell their stories, because stories are so powerful and they do help connect people. That's what you've done here today. So Edward Gangi, thank you so much for being here and having this conversation.
Well, James, thanks so much for allowing me the conversation. I've enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining me today. If you've enjoyed this content and are thinking about ways to share your story or even get more joy out of your life, I have a free ebook that I'd love to share with you. It's called Plotting Your Joyful Rebellion, and I designed it to be a 5-step field guide full of guerrilla warfare tactics to help prepare you to overthrow any of the parts of your life you feel the call to rebel against. Go to ajoyfulrebellion.com and click on the link right there at the top to claim your free copy of the book. Again, that's ajoyfulrebellion.com, or simply hit the link at the top of the show notes. What sort of rebellion are you plotting right now? I'd love to hear about it. Connect with me on Facebook, Instagram, or through the website at ajoyfulrebellion.com. Thanks again for listening today, and be sure to stop by next week for another episode full of joyful rebellion.